This presentation is about the Indians, the American Indians of the American West. The Indians of the American Northeast had already been beaten into the ground. Of the Southeast had already been, back in the 1820s and 30s, moved off of their land by white people. And as the country was growing industrially and urban development was exploding, the white people needed land. The American Indians were as mistreated, more than some and less than others, as the Canadian Indians or the South American Indians or the Central American Indians or Africans or Siberian people in Siberia when the Russians moved to the east as the Americans moved to the west, and in about the same time frame. The Indian people lived very basic lives compared to the white people, and so therefore the white people believed them to be savages, and the white people believed in something called manifest destiny. It was the destiny of white people to take over land occupied by savage people. And also, it was their Christian destiny. Savages, because they were not believers in Jesus Christ, therefore they were savages, and therefore the whites had a right to do anything they wanted to them. The Indians lived in small villages. Some Indian people were hunter-gatherers, hunters being hunters of buffalo, fishing, gathering and trading and raiding, and others were farm people. The Plains Indians, and if you Google the American Plains, you can see that there's a strip from Canada to Mexico down through the beginning of the western part on the western side of the Mississippi River. They depended on the buffalo. It's a pretty impressive, you can see by the picture, it's a very impressive animal, very, very large animal, much larger than a cow. And there were millions. The Indians depended on the buffalo for everything. I made a list there: clothes, shoes, blankets, thread, bowstrings, tools from the bones. Their tents were made of buffalo hides. They didn't use cloth. They used the skin of the buffalo and other animals, but mostly the buffalo. The farmer Indians, you will find evidence in the southwest. I'm thinking of the Hopi and the Navajo Indians. And then in the northwest, you will find other tribes of Indians that were mostly fishermen in Washington and Oregon and north into northwest Canada. The whites, they destroyed everything. Indians were occupying land that the whites could use for their farming and their mercantilist way of living. By destroying the Indian, by destroying the buffalo, they would destroy the Indian way of life. And there are many horrible stories of, in the 1880s, 1890s, after the railroads were put through the West, people taking buffalo killing expeditions, massacring the buffalo from the train windows, just staying on the train, drinking and shooting out the windows at the buffalo, killing as many as possible and just leaving them there. The Indians never wasted anything. To the Indians, all things of nature were sacred, including especially the buffalo. By the 1880s, there were only a few hundred buffalo left. That's changed a lot. I went to a reservation with my father many years ago, and there were several hundred buffalo on the reservation. In the Northwest, the whites destroyed the commercial fishing, or they created commercial fishing and destroyed the fishing grounds of the Indians. The white people, think about this, please. They saw the Indians as they saw all non-white people. They were primitive, whether Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, Africans, indigenous people of the Caribbean islands, blacks, everyone were primitive, savage, lazy, devious, cruel, and non-Christian. The whites forced the Indians into violence because they were trying to defend themselves. You may have read this somewhere about scalping and taking a trophy when you killed someone in battle. That wasn't invented by the Indians. That was invented by the French, actually, back in the 1700s in the Northeast, coming down from Canada. Whites introduced diseases. If you read carefully the history of Central and South America, some 12 million indigenous people died of the diseases brought by the so-called conquistadores. Syphilis, gonorrhea, yellow fever, and whiskey. The white government policies were to remove the Indians, get them out of the way so the white people could take the land and become farmers. The government made no distinction between any particular group of Indians. All Indians were the same. And I think it was William Tecumseh Sherman who had invaded through the southern United States and Georgia and then up to South Carolina and North Carolina during the Civil War. The best Indian was a dead Indian. They put the Indians on reservations. As much you could probably make an analogy of how the Spanish put the indigenous people in the highlands of Ecuador and Peru on haciendas. Only I think they might have even been treated better on the haciendas. The Indians were forced into a market economy. That means that they forced them to live at the pleasure of white people. They set up the Indian Bureau, and the Indians would create things, artisan products, buffalo products to sell to white people, and the white people would trade blankets and some guns and some whiskey, maybe a lot of whiskey. When the Indians tried to fight back, the white people came down on them. You can see here the Homestead Act of 1860, 160 acres of free land to the whites. Didn't make any difference that it was owned by or occupied, not owned. The Indians didn't live that way. They were communal people, tribal people. Nobody owned land. Land belonged to nature. They borrowed it. When they finished the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1880s, the Indians came out to fight, but it was hopeless. I mentioned the Battle of the Little Bighorn because in American lore, American history, a great defeat of the American soldiers, but the General George Armstrong Custer was a very pretentious, arrogant young man, the youngest general in the Union Army in the Civil War, and then 12 years later, commander of troops out west, up in the northwest, and they invaded a piece of land, or going after the Indians, not knowing that on the other side of the hill were over several thousand Lakota and Cheyenne Indians, and the Indians killed them all. And it was a great massacre. You can imagine the reaction in the white man's newspapers back east. Indians resisted. White people said, well, we need to make them be like us. We have to take these Indians and take those clothes and throw them away and put them in store-bought pants and shirt and shoes and cut their hair like white people do. And of course, it didn't make any difference to the Indians. They could put all the white man's clothes on they wanted, but the white men were still very racist and very discriminatory. And there were very few cases of any successful, what you can call, transition to white man's ways. They wanted them to act like civilized white people. They wanted them to be Christians, and they wanted them to be materialists, consumers of white man's products. Most reformers believed the Indians were culturally inferior to the whites. Everyone believed that. And they also, pretty much the attitude that white Westerners or Westerners in general have today about Taliban, about the way they treat their women, which is contrary to the way Western men treat their women, I hope. The last struggle of the indigenous people was the ghost dance, and very good video. Go on YouTube and type in ghost dance, and you can see that the Indians were at the end of their existence, and they knew it. The Indian, I think is Wakova, he convinced people that there was a special shirt, leather shirt with designs on it, and that would protect you from the white man's bullets. And they would dance themselves into a trance and scared the white people. And besides that, there was anti-Christian. So go to, I put the YouTube address on there. But I always thought that two really good movies was Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. You can find it on YouTube. And Dancing with Wolves. And I put those up there, The Tragedy of Wounded Knee. What were the whites looking for? Land. Land and everything that was in the land. Gold, silver, copper, zinc, lead, all the minerals, water resources. They wanted to control everything. Yesterday we watched a great video from YouTube about the Panama Canal and how the white American people, this was in 1903 to 1914, had the nerve, what I always thought was extremely audacious attitude of just, I don't care if there's a mountain in the way, and I don't care if we have to dig, we'll dig it and we'll make it because we can control nature. And all through the history of the United States, from the 1860s even to present, they can take anything down or put anything up, and they do. Put a man on the moon, they do. Anything you can imagine. It's a tremendous confidence, self-confidence in the culture, and also backed up by unbelievable engineering technologies. Mining, lumber, I mentioned timber. You need timber, all the tremendous forests in the northwestern United States. And then finally in the late 1880s, discovery of oil. And there's a great videos on YouTube called The Prize, the history of oil, the exploration and exploitation of oil. I put this in here to give you some idea how racism was, and some students yesterday actually said, yeah, it still is. The whites are on top, then the Spanish-speaking Mexicans and Nicaraguans and all the way south, then the Indians, then the Chinese below them, and then the Negroes on the bottom. I just mentioned this because when I was a very young boy, I liked cowboy movies. I haven't seen one in many, many years, probably since Dancing with Wolves 15, 20 years ago. But there were the newspapers. You could call it yellow journalism. Then there was the creation of the 10-cent novels, people writing stories about all these great so-called heroes, but they weren't heroes. Wyatt Earp and his brothers were murderers, but they were murderers who became the sheriff and the sheriff's deputies. Annie Oakley, Wild Bill Hickok was a traveling circus, a western circus. Even went to England and played before the Queen Victoria. And then outlaws. And outlaws typically, you can think of the Robin Hood type. They would rob the banks, rob trains, rob stagecoaches, and people benefited by it because they gave money to the people. And Billy the Kid was famous because I don't know, he killed 10 people by the time he was 15 or say 18 or something like that. And then some of the great writers, and I've always enjoyed Mark Twain. I've taught English in several different schools over the years in Ecuador, and I always pull out Mark Twain because the students, they enjoy the story so much. What made the West? The railroads. And there's the numbers. 35,000 miles of track in 1865, and 35 years later, 200,000 miles of train track with trains on them. In 1900, the United States contained 1/3 of all the railroad tracks in the world. Gauge is the distance between the two rails. That by the late 1800s, they had made a standard gauge. All trains in the United States ran on the same gauge, because I remember stories about the Civil War where when you get to the line between Alabama and Georgia, you had to take everything off the train and put them on a Georgia train, because the Georgia train had a different gauge than the Alabama train. There's a mention here somewhere, standard time. Trains have to run on time. They have to leave on time, because there were many cases of trains colliding because they were off. So they created the time zones across the United States. There are 4 time zones, still exists. And then you have to think of what trains and railroads do is all the ancillary, the secondary economic demands for steel. The steel industry explodes. Coal, passenger and freight cars, depots, new towns along the rails that when they stopped running the trains through, the towns died immediately and the people who lived there went somewhere else. And then there's about farming. When we get to the 1930s, you're going to learn about the Dust Bowl. Oklahoma and Kansas and Arkansas, and how the people back in the 1880s, 1890s, took the land, stripped off the topsoil, and farmed. But then 50 years later, 30 years later, whatever, tremendous dust storms, deadly dust storms. Farming was extremely terrible life. My father retired from the Army. He bought a farm up in the mountains of New York, and I shake when I think about the kind of work I was doing when I was in high school, although it wasn't. Now I look back on it and I realize that hard work is probably really good for developing character, because it keeps you from being afraid of working hard the rest of your life. But I did run away and join the Navy to get away from the cows and the horses and the pigs and ducks and chickens and geese and everything else that was on his zoo. Farm life is always a victim of the weather. Doesn't make any difference what kind of farming you do, even if you have shrimp farms, bananas. In Ecuador, up in the Sierra, they raise broccoli and asparagus for export. We have occasional, well, in in Lima, I remember somebody told me it doesn't rain for several years. Not good for farming. Then in the northern United States, you've got blizzards, and you probably haven't experienced it yet, but someday you might if you go north of Houston. I've been in several blizzards. The snow is a meter high, 2 meters high. I remember some blizzards of 3 meters high, and the wind is 80, 100 miles an hour sometimes. I put this in here as one of the last things. The people who lived out in the West were isolated from what you would call civilization, urban life. They were extremely rural. By the 1880s, this one says 1895 on it, but it was earlier than that. Companies like Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck, they invented a marketing tool called a catalog. We don't have these things anymore, not many anyway. 25 years ago when I left the States, yeah, you got catalogs in the mail all the time. But what's interesting about this, you can buy almost anything in a Sears Roebuck or a Montgomery Ward catalog, including a house, which they would ship to you piece by piece. The Rochester house was $1,387 for the whole house. Of course, some people were making $5 a week, too. And then the government created the mail delivery system, RFD, Rural Free Delivery. You had mail delivery 6 days a week. You could buy anything at all, farm equipment, shoes, boots, hats, weapons, anything through the mail, through rural free delivery. The government would